Wikipedia has two different pages for this one event that happened in Gaza last week. Now, to some, this was a hostage rescue operation where 4 Israeli captives held against their will by Hamas for 9 months were rescued and reunited with their families. But for others, this was a massacre where hundreds of Palestinians lost their lives after Israeli forces opened fire indiscriminately in the middle of a refugee camp. Now, I'm not trying to say that Wikipedia is the end-all, be-all arbiter of all things true, not by a long shot, but we have to agree that a lot of people go to that website to help influence their opinion and gather data on current events as they're playing out. So I think it's notable that in this case, if you go to Wikipedia and you type in Nusrat Massacre, you're going to get a very different series of events than if you type in Nusrat Hostage Rescue. But realistically, they're talking about the exact same operation. Now, last week, we talked about an outline by the Jewish Chronicle where they went minute by minute through the course of this operation. So today, we're going to talk about the other perspective. This is Al Jazeera's reporting from the Palestinian perspective of what happened in Nusrat last week. It's titled Nusrat, Anatomy of Israel's Massacre in Gaza. Now, the primary focus throughout this piece is really that Israeli forces were indiscriminately killing Palestinian civilians, but I do want to highlight 3 key aspects right out the gate. First, there's no mention of humanitarian aid trucks throughout the Gaza piece being used to facilitate this operation. There's no mention of the Gaza pier being used to facilitate this operation. There's also no mention of Hamas, at all, taking part, firing on Israeli forces, anything like that. Hamas is notably absent from the Al Jazeera reporting here. Now, I can already see the comments pushing back. Why are you using Al Jazeera? It's a biased source. It's not reliable, so on and so forth. Look, no matter what you, me, or anyone else feels about the journalism at Al Jazeera, the fact is this is where a ton of people around the world have their entire opinion shaped around this conflict. I mean, for reference, they have something like 1.4 billion viewers across their digital platforms over the course of a 90-day period, which means it's pretty important to understand what a lot of people are viewing took place in Nusrat just a couple days ago. Now, starting out, they say witnesses describe a violent ambush with indiscriminate shooting and air raids. Camp resident Anas Al-Yan said Israeli soldiers committed mass executions on the street. Now, this was in English. This is Al Jazeera English, and there might have been some translation issues, but executions point to something very different than collateral damage. A lot of the early reports we had, especially coming from Israel, was, look, there might have been civilians killed during the course of this operation. It was collateral damage as Hamas was firing on the commandos trying to extract the hostages. This is an entirely different story and a different claim than I've seen really anywhere else. Executions suggest that, civilians were lined up and just shot simply for being Palestinian civilians. That's a pretty significant accusation. They say the attack on Nusrat was ostensibly to free 4 captives taken on October 7th. It began around 11 a.m. with what witnesses say were several civilian trucks and cars entering a neighborhood near the camp's market. One was loaded with furniture to appear it was moving displaced people, while another had commercial brand markings. There were also what appeared to be civilian vehicles in the group. I'm not sure what Al Jazeera is showing here is actually the infiltration of the commandos into Gaza, or at least into Nusrat. The reason for that is we do have one of the pictures of those trucks taken from Palestinian civilians after the course of the operation played out. It's a white truck, kind of some furniture stacked on top with a ladder. What they're showing in this picture here is civilian vehicles mixed in with a military convoy. The whole purpose of using these civilian vehicles was for the commandos to try to go undetected as they approached and set up outside of the buildings that the hostage were located in. If they're driving alongside Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers, it defeats that purpose entirely. So I'm not, at this point, convinced that the picture here is what actually was used during the raid. It just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't line up with other accounts. But again, notable, that is the closest Al Jazeera comes in this report, or really anything I've seen, to saying that humanitarian aid trucks were used during this operation. So a commercial vehicle with commercial markings driving alongside tanks, I believe, from everything I've seen, that is the evidence that some people point to about humanitarian aid trucks being used. They say to provide air cover, Israeli forces started bombing from above, hitting the busy market the hardest, likely to spread as much panic as possible, as well as inflict maximum casualties. So hard to tell why somebody drops a bomb on a specific target at a specific time. In this case, Al Jazeera is saying that it is to cause panic because they're dropping it in a crowded market full of civilians and to inflict as many casualties as possible. In previous reports, it sounded like there were some strikes outside of Nusrat, but that the actual strikes in the camp itself didn't occur until after the extraction was underway to try to clear the route for Israeli forces as they evacuate. So a little discrepancy there, right? They say that 3 male captives were at one location, where an Al Jazeera witness account details how soldiers got into the house. There, heavily armed soldiers jumped out and ran through a cluster of makeshift tents put up by displaced people. They say the witness describes how everyone cowered in fear inside their flimsy shelters, little more than a piece of fabric between them and the armed soldiers. The soldiers arrived at a garden wall, through which they punched a hole to approach a quiet apartment building from the back. Al Jazeera has not been able to ascertain whether this was the only access to the building, which is surrounded by a garden on at least 2 sides and likely faces onto a road. This is one of the clips that I believe we already have footage of from Israel, showing the Israeli forces moving into this house and securing the 3 male hostages. I do want to point out, in this case, though, they're talking about how the Israeli forces, we have 2 different accounts already. One woman talking about executions taking place on the street of Palestinian civilians, but then in this case, we've got Israeli forces running through a crowded civilian area and just moving through to get to the objective. So on the one hand, Israeli forces are shooting all the Palestinians, but on the other, they're moving right past them when they're in these, tents that would not stop a bullet to get to the hostage location. They say Noah Argamani was in another location, in a building facing a narrow tree-lined street. There, a truck pulled up, supported by soldiers shooting on sight, killing one person at the building's entrance. From footage Al Jazeera reviewed, there were no weapons near or on the killed individual. Look, this is a challenge in any unconventional war, and I don't have any more information than what we just read here and what's been put out by Israel. So it's entirely having to read between the lines, but something that we dealt with a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I know that Israel has had to deal with in Gaza and the West Bank, is that a militant can appear to become a civilian so long as they don't have a weapon. And in many cases, a militant is killed during an engagement. Somebody simply removes that weapon from their body, either during the operation as they fall or after the extraction is complete, right? And there's no longer Israeli forces on the objective. Somebody walks up, moves that weapon away so somebody else can use it, but also now it just looks like a dead civilian. It looks like somebody was shot indiscriminately on the ground simply for being there. Wrong place, wrong time. Again, I don't have any information to say that that did happen or it didn't happen, but it's an aspect of this type of unconventional war where there's no uniforms, there's no dog tags, there's no military bases. So if you just remove that weapon after the person has died, that militant becomes a civilian. They say, or appears to become a civilian, I should say. They say that a ladder was extended from the truck and soldiers clambered onto an apartment through its balcony. Reports Al Jazeera gathered indicate that Israeli soldiers were shooting people on site in buildings as well as on the streets. So again, we're kind of getting both of these, but this is where the majority of this reporting sits, is that Israeli soldiers were just opening fire left and right wherever they could. Now, we don't have all of the footage that Israel has released at this point, but we do have some, both of the forces moving in to rescue the hostages, and then some of the reinforcements later in the morning moving in to kind of assist with their evacuation. In neither one of those do we see Israeli forces engaging really anything. Now, we do know there were significant engagements throughout the Nusrat camp during and after this extraction. So we don't have that footage, right? We haven't seen that. So it's not to say that this didn't happen, but we haven't seen that footage provided. This is also another point I want to highlight, that throughout this, they're talking about Israeli soldiers firing indiscriminately, opening fire everywhere they see people. Again, to highlight, there's no mention of Hamas at all throughout this entirety. Remember, one Israeli commando was killed and multiple wounded during the course of this engagement. So there were some there, somewhere, firing on Israeli forces. That part is entirely absent from this reporting. They say more Israeli soldiers landed in a helicopter on Gaza shore not far from the U.S.-built pier. That is it when it comes to the Gaza pier being referenced. There are still videos and comments and tweets and articles coming out accusing the pier, if you can do that, of being used during the course of this operation, or humanitarian aid trucks being used during the course of this operation. Even in Al Jazeera's reporting here, they're not talking about that. What this all stems from is a couple accounts right the day of this operation immediately said, they came from the pier. It doesn't make sense that they would come from the pier. And it doesn't make military sense, it doesn't make logistical sense, and it doesn't make diplomatic sense. The United States would not be, from what I can tell, on board with Israel using this pier that they set up for humanitarian purposes to carry out a lethal raid, even if that raid is designed to rescue hostages. Again, doesn't make sense. The pier is rickety, not hardly working at all from what I can tell. And Israel has full access through the Nusrat Road, through the middle of the Gaza Strip. They could easily move in a myriad of other ways. There's no reason to choose the more complicated, in a lot of ways, option over the easy option. They say analysis indicates that these were there to provide the folks that landed in the helicopter near the pier backup and to evacuate the captives who headed there in the convoy of disguised trucks and civilian vehicles taking the Nusrat Road. This is also one where in the clip of that I've seen of the helicopter taking off, you can't actually see the vehicle that arrives on scene. The clips we do have of the hostages reaching the helicopters, they're on foot. Now, they didn't move from Nusrat to this location on foot. They were in a vehicle. We've also seen some footage of the commandos being picked up in armored vehicles. So it's not clear where that happened versus in other locations where they may have taken civilian vehicles. I do know a challenge as Israeli forces exited the buildings, as relayed by Israel, is that their vehicles that they were planning on use to get off of the objective had been struck by Hamas fire and were no longer operable. So whether they jumped in civilian vehicles to use those to get out of the area or if it was military vehicles, either way, their originally planned exit did not go as planned. They say that at least 274 people died in Saturday's massacre, including at least 64 children, and more than 700 were injured, according to the health ministry in Gaza. Among those Israel killed are 3 Israeli captives, one of whom had U.S. citizenship. Israeli spokesperson Hagari claimed on Saturday that only dozens of Palestinians had been killed in the attack, telling a briefing he knew of less than 100 casualties, but couldn't say how many were civilians. So a few notes on that we've talked about in a previous video. That 274 number killed hasn't changed. 274 killed, 700 wounded has on or about been consistent for a couple days now. According to Al Jazeera's data a couple days ago, after removing the women, the children, and the elderly, we're left with about 116 unnamed or not, like they must be men, military-aged men. That doesn't mean that they're all Hamas, not by a long shot, but it would indicate that, 116 or so out of the 274 per Al Jazeera's reporting could potentially be Hamas militants. And again, I want to stress that throughout this entire piece, there's no mention that Hamas is there at all in any way, shape, or form. A note on the 3 hostages, Al Jazeera is reporting here that is a fact. I've not seen evidence of that other than Qassam brigades, the militant wing of Hamas, saying that it happened. We still haven't seen proof. We've seen a video of blurred out bodies. It could be those 3 hostages that were killed during this operation. It could be something entirely different, or it could be 3 hostages that died a few weeks ago, and Hamas is now saying that it happened during the course of this operation. Again, no evidence that 3 were killed, no evidence that they were killed during the course of this operation. Nothing firm, at least, as of now. They also talked to, just a little bit, some international reactions to this event, saying Egypt and Jordan condemned the massacre. The EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell, said what happened in Nusrat was a massacre, and Oxfam International called the massacre, quote, unacceptable and unconscionable. So, again, this is the Al Jazeera series of events from Nusrat a few days ago, what they refer to as a massacre, what others refer to as the hostage rescue operation. Again, a couple days ago, I talked about the Israeli perspective of how this operation took place, from the undercover agents to a secret infill to reinforcements rushing on scene, danger close fires, all that stuff, like it's straight out of a movie. This hopefully provides the other perspective, what the Palestinians viewed as this operation played out. But I'll link this source article as well as the video from the Israeli perspective in the description below, along with our Substack, which is our reader-funded publication focused on war, conflict, and national security subjects. Articles about Islamic State, Hezbollah, China, Russia, Yemen, quite a bit more. Podcasts, ad-free videos, things like that. Again, all in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.